Yay.
Well, hi, everybody. Hi. Thanks for coming. My name is Esther, and I'm the Chief Curator here at Union Hall. And as some of you know, Union Hall is a small nonprofit art gallery, and we predominantly support emerging curators and emerging artists in the Denver area. We also create opportunities for international artists on occasion as well. Tonight we are going to be talking a little bit about Tender Machines, which is this exhibition that is behind me. We have Alex Branch here tonight. We also have Bill Nelson here tonight. And L.A. Samuelson is in the exhibition as well, but they are living in New York currently, so we have a cassette tape to play that'll talk a little bit about L.A.'s work in the show. And then Fernando Orellana is a New York artist, and his work is behind me. So he's not here tonight, but we do have online a presentation that he gave of his work that's also in the show that you can check out online. So for Tender Machines, the idea for this exhibition really just came from my personal love and adoration of mechanical artwork and moving sculpture. I'm just a huge fan of that, and as an artist myself, I dabble a little bit in those mediums as well. I was already familiar with a lot of the artists in the show and had kind of been admiring their work for a long time, and I thought that it would be really nice to see a lot of the pieces in one place together. So that's kind of how it originated. For me personally, there's just a lot of wonder and curiosity in the way these pieces are put together. And so when you walk into the space, it's very hard not to want to touch them and tinker with them. But I think that is a really important aspect of this work, because it really brings into light the physicality and materiality of it. And so often these days we're kind of immersed in this digital realm. Oh, thank you. Yeah. But yeah, because we're so immersed in our digital lives, digital reality, I think this kind of work really brings us back to the physical space and brings us back to this sort of playful place of tinkering and play. And a little bit of engineering too, and just this type of figuring things out that happens when you're creating work like this. I know that process myself as an artist, and so I admire other people who engage in that process as well. So the idea of merging tenderness and human emotion with mechanisms and robots, I think also sort of brings up current topics around what's going on in the artificial intelligence realm, which I also think is really interesting, although the work here isn't necessarily AI. Some of it is generative, and I think that it just touches on those current topics right now. But one of the kind of current underlying themes that you'll see across all of the works is a lot of these pieces employ vintage objects or analog technology, nostalgic items that kind of express a tendency towards sentimentality, memories, reminiscing of the past, things that sort of evoke tender experiences and memories, objects that have been sort of cared for or deemed as precious. There's a lot of that in this show as well. As far as an overall theme. And some of the work also alludes to people who have passed on, or that this sort of desire to have a communication with the other side as well. So there's a little bit of that in there. And so what you're looking at right here is a music box boat for the Mississippi River, and this was created by Denver artist Alex Branch. Alex Branch I used to be a creative director at Platform, and Alex was one of the residents there before my time, and I became familiar with their work and was really excited to meet Alex and have been kind of meeting up with Alex and following her work for a while. But I really love how she takes bits of pieces of things that are broken and old and maybe even just like apart from this or apart from that, and she'll compile them into like a whole new piece that's usually mechanical or musical in nature. And for me personally, I feel like they have just pulling all of these really cool pieces from something and creating a whole new work creates this kind of mythical fairy tale object. At least that's how I feel when I see her work or engage with her work. And so this boat right here is meant, I think, to actually be on the Mississippi River. There's a lot of paddle boats on the Mississippi. And it's still a work in progress, but Alex is here, so I'll let Alex talk a little bit about it. And I'll give you this microphone. Do you want to hold it?
Just like this? Or
Yeah.
is it?
Yeah, you can just put it anywhere.
Put it on. Maybe. Hopefully it doesn't fall off.
Yeah.
Yes. So this boat is intended to be on the Mississippi River. I'm actually working on a series of boats, and this is the second boat in the series. The first boat was built for the Rio Grande, and this one was built for the Mississippi. And like Esther had said, I was thinking about paddle wheel boats that were going up and down the river, and also music boxes. So the, I don't know if you can actually see into it, but so this barrel, when I spent a lot of time in St. Louis, and it struck me just the architecture of the place. And so I incorporated some architectural elements. So this is a column from a building that I cut into pieces, and this is part of the column, and then the paddles are part of the column as well that are cut up. And then thinking about the inside of a music box, there was something about the movement of the music box that I felt like was similar to the movement of the paddle wheel boats, and so I wanted to link them together and kind of make a hybrid of that. And in the process of it, I was trying to find something to make the musical comb. If you've ever taken a music box apart, you know that there's a comb inside of it, and the barrel has little pins on it which pluck and play the comb. And so I was looking for something that would simulate that or be similar to that, but a larger scale. And so what seemed perfect to me was a saw, so just like a hand saw. So that's what I used, and I cut the saw. Musical saws are played usually with a bow, but what I did was cut different keys so that you can play it, and you can actually hear. I don't know if you'll be able to hear. Well, actually, maybe you'll be able to hear. But so I'll put it down there. So so it works mechanically at this point, but the part that I'm still working on is the actual plucking mechanism, which is, you can see here that I have these bands, and I want it to actually be changeable so that a musician could screw in different picks that would play and pluck the notes, so the composition could be changed. But I still have not actually found the right, right here I have so I'll turn it, I have just a pick, and I've tried a metal pick. This is just a plastic pick, and it doesn't make the sound, it's not the right, it doesn't resonate like when it's hit with metal or hit in a certain way. So that's something, when Esther had mentioned I'm still working on it, that's the aspect of it that still needs resolution. But it works, so I can show you how it works. I'll just climb in. And actually what ended up happening is I collect a lot of saws, a lot of hand saws, and I've cut a lot of them, the keys at different sizes, and experimented with them that way. But I had so many saws that, and I hadn't figured out what the paddles would actually be made out of, and then it just kind of made sense for the paddles to be the saws. So that's what the actual blades are, saw blades. And I also just really admire just the sculptural quality of the saw blades. And I found, as I was collecting them, a lot of times the person whose saw it had been would carve their initials into the blade handle, or the handle of the saw. So that was an interesting little detail that you find. So I'll just sort of demonstrate. So these are, I don't know, maybe you put it back up here. So these are handles that you can hold onto when you're pedaling, and then you can just pedal it. And so eventually as you're doing this, it'll play. So and another thing that once I figure out the actual the plucking mechanism, I'd like to have two saws, one saw at the top, one saw at the bottom, so you could add a saw, so then there could be kind of double amplification. And part of making these boats was I spent time on a boat in New York that was docked in the Hudson River, and just the resonation from sounds around that boat, how it would resonate in the body of the boat, really made me want to make an instrument that was a boat and an instrument at the same time. So it's right here.
Thank you, Alex. Really quick, I mean, unless you already knew how to build boats, what was the process for just kind of learning how to build a boat in the first place that you can actually take on the river?
It was kind of a long process. I started, just kind of researching boat building. I went to different museums. I read a lot of books. And then I actually had an email correspondence with a boat builder. And I just asked, a lot of questions. I went to a place where they were working on boats in Brooklyn, where I was living. I learned about different techniques, and the technique that I used is called stitch and glue, which is a fast way to build a boat. It's kind of based on this old technique called the sewn boat sort of technique, where with sewn boats they would use tendons and things to kind of lash a boat together. It was before they had metal fasteners. And so this boat, so it's pieces, that I cut out of plywood, and it's thin plywood. It's 1/4 inch ply, so it was bendable, which is really, it allows you to make a structure that's still lightweight. This boat is actually pretty heavy because I had to reinforce it in a lot of ways. The other boat I built is really lightweight, but it can be, in principle, using 1/4 inch plywood, it can be really a lightweight sort of structure, but strong because it also has, epoxy resin on it and fiberglass at the seams. But how you actually assemble it is you put the pieces together with wire stitches initially, and then so it's wired at the seams, and then you tack that. You use a combination of epoxy and wood flour. It makes kind of a almost peanut butter-like consistency, and then you tack it between the wires, and you let it set, and then you snip all the wires, and then you run a seam. So if you look down, you can see the seam of the wood flour. Yeah. And so that just holds it all together, and then you do a layer of glass over top of that.
Wow, okay. Cool. Well, thanks for sharing. Oh, really quick, do you have anything coming up art-wise, exhibition-wise that you want to share with our audience?
Let's see. There's an opening at the Pratt or the Parker Arts Center tomorrow night, and then there's a closing at Bell Projects at the Bell Projects on Sunday. It's a show that's based on bread that I have some
cool.
work in too. So those two
okay.
things. Yeah.
Fun. Thanks. Okay, we also have Bill Nelson here, and this piece behind me is called The Pilot. And the pilot, as you can see, is very alive, but it was inspired by a memory Bill had with his grandfather. And I am also very excited and inspired by Bill and his work, because every time I talk to him, I come away with some crazy story or some crazy bit of history that I knew nothing about and really interested in learning more about it. But Bill is an artist, but also a collector and a storyteller, and he creates a lot of different types of things, one of which are mechanical works, but then he also will assemble natural elements of the natural world, juxtaposed with elements of industry, to kind of tell a story, or share or evoke a type of dystopian feel. So, but I'll let Bill talk more about his pieces.
Your opening remarks really encapsulated what this is really about. Being a parent, and probably not a very good one, although we have some fun, I'm always thinking about the relationships kids have with their parents, their grandparents, their environment, their school friends, and how all that adds up to the human beings that they become. And so thinking about my own upbringing, sometimes I think, how did I end up where I am today? And so much of it was just living poor, and the experiences I had with my own father, but particularly my grandfather. He was a guy that liked to make things. He had a workshop, and it was filled. When you're poor, you don't throw many things away. And so even simple things like, I remember he had lots of cans that he would take the paper off of, and we were constantly making things out of cans. We'd make telephones that you run the string before, and you could actually hear each other. That was a fascination for me. We would build scooters out of old abandoned roller skates and 2x4s. And the best part was putting the soup can as a headlight on the front, and it suddenly became a headlight and not a soup can. And you could imagine that and feel that as I was rolling down the sidewalk. So being a fan, as everyone in here is, of old things, when I came across this guy here, I wish I could say I built this. I didn't. This is an old Santa Claus, probably from the 1920s. And he wasn't working, and he was made out of paper mache, and I took his body off, and this was the skeleton of an old Santa Claus. His arm was reversed because he used to ring a bell and probably sit in front of an old department store. And when I plugged him in, which is always a little scary when you plug in a 1920s piece of things is going to electrocute you, and it didn't work. But a lot of times the electric motors are frozen, and the grease gets kind of hard. And I remember taking the motor apart and seeing that telltale frozen grease and knocking it out of there and re-greasing it and putting it all together and plugging it and seeing that inner mechanism spring to life. And then I was off to the races at that point and thought, what could I possibly make out of this great find out in the secondary market? And I thought an homage to my grandfather would be a good thing to do. Making a paper airplane is such a milestone for a kid, and I, with great joy, taught my son how to make a great paper airplane that could really fly. But I learned how to make a paper airplane by my grandfather. In fact, he was almost taken aback that my own father had not taught me how to make a paper airplane yet. And so that was a big moment for me to fold it. And my grandfather was always good about making me do it, right? You do it. I'll show you how, but you do it. And to make my first airplane, this particular form's called a dart, and throwing that across the room and seeing it sail across in the air currents was very satisfying. And so that's what I thought would be my inspiration for this piece. And of course, I could have attached it more beautifully, like this unbelievable craft over here. But as a child, this is how I would have done it with a clothespin and a rubber band. So I wanted to keep my unions and connections very primitive and relive some of those experiences. So I decided to have him throw a paper airplane, reverse his arm, grease the motor, get it all working again. And then, of course, instead of a Santa's head, I had to decide what to put on there. And I thought a pilot's head would be interesting because maybe, just maybe, if you teach a kid how to throw a paper airplane, maybe that serves as a seed that grows in them, and maybe he will fly an airplane someday and become interested in aviation as I am. And so that's it. And he had it, this was for his big Santa belly. There was a little workshop table there, so I thought it would be an expression of affection to try to create the joy of looking through my grandfather's stuff. I think Esther noticed this too, but my grandfather had one of these. Oh, it's in there now, pretty good. But these flat construction pencils made that was where things happened. When you had a pencil and you could draw something, things were made at that point. So when I came across this red construction flat pencil, that was the very one in my childhood that I could draw pictures with. So this was literally the cherry on the sundae was the flat construction pencil. And when it all came together, and seems to be still working, it was a very happy day for me indeed.
So Alex and Bill also have other works in the show as well, but we don't need to go into more detail unless you want to. Bill also has a piece called Love Me Tender that's includes taxidermy, and it sings a song, and it's in the back. And because our camera is stationary, we won't walk over there. But
It seemed destined for this show.
Yeah.
Because I had made it, and it always played Love Me Tender. And so when you said Tender Machines, and you were looking around at different things I had made, it's hard not to look at that.
Yeah.
And of course, it was hard for you not to look at it, but I was very excited to get it working because, of course, it's a bear taxidermy that sings Love Me Tender, and seemed inevitable to be in here.
The origin story of that taxidermy is really interesting. I don't know if you want to share just a little bit about it.
It's a short story and it's a long story, but
Sorry.
I am a huge fan of interesting people. And one of the most interesting people in Colorado history, I actually thought her name was Flossie. I'd known her for decades, always called her Flossie because she had a costume shop on Broadway, you may know, called Flossie McGrew's. And she was a vampire and had lots of interesting stories, including being attracted to a bare-knuckle boxer in her childhood who helped her bear her son, who is a very interesting character living in Africa. It's a very interesting family. And so we were friends for many years, and one day she just walked out onto her porch and had a heart attack and died. And it was this amazing, sad event, because what is going to happen? She lived in a church, often sharing a space with her deceased bare-knuckle boxer boyfriend in a coffin. I mean, these are crazy stories. And her son came in from Africa to handle the estate. And I said, you know, your mom and I were friends for years, and my head is spinning right now. We should have a conversation about what's going to happen with all of these things. And so we had that conversation, and part of Flossie, which was interesting, I actually asked him at the time, and I kept calling her Flossie, and he goes, you know, my mom's name is not even Flossie. And I go, oh my God. I didn't know that. And I go, what is her name? And he said, Sue, a bitch named Sue. And I immediately made a sculpture right after that, and I called it A Bitch Named Sue, But it was a part of a collection of dragonflies she had from the 19th century. It's one of the most astonishingly beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. Hundreds of dragonflies. If you coughed, a wing would fall off. That's the level of her collection. But she also had taxidermy, one of the amazing collections. People kind of know this and kind of don't know this, but Denver has been a center for taxidermy since the late 1800s. Started in Colorado Springs. Some Hungarians named Jonas Brothers. You may have seen the sign on Broadway, Jonas Brothers Furs. That sign is actually the oldest neon sign in Denver and still existing on top of the building. Pretty interesting. The Jonas Brothers were all from Hungary, and they were expert taxidermists, and they came here and they started a practice, eventually split up. One went to Seattle, one went to New York, and one stayed here. But they were known for some of the most beautiful, exotic taxidermy destined for zoological exhibitions, natural history museums, and yes, some trophy hunting that was taking place in Africa. Over the years, their business moved further and further away from natural history museums and zoological exhibitions and became kind of around creating fur coats, which became extremely unpopular in the 1970s and 80s, and they essentially went out of business. And at the time that happened, they had thousands of pieces of taxidermy in their own collection that they had made, but also from people that had hired them to make special pieces that later they couldn't afford to pull out of there, and they had a collection of unclaimed taxidermy. And Flossie, Sue Lynn, I learned her name actually was, got a lot of this taxidermy from the unclaimed components of this collection. One of them was a tiger that had eaten a very famous woman tiger tamer in circus history in Denver circus lore. And I was able to acquire that during this time, and along with a very special zebra with a great story. The collection's a little crazy over at my house. But also this bear was a part of that collection. The bear, I know, was part of the naturalistic delivery of taxidermy from this collection because the snarl is so important to that type of artistry to create the feeling of what a bear feels like in the wild, rather than a shot trophy like, look, I killed this bear, you know. I knew this was something different because that was the nature of her collection. She also had a huge collection of mummified cats, which I found very intriguing, snakes, lizards, everything with a bit of a darker, almost macabre feeling about it, given her own personal interest in art and collecting. So during that period, the Gustafson, that was her last name, estate, to people who knew her son, got parceled out to interested collectors, and that's how that piece entered the show. That was the short version. That was kind of the medium version of that story.
That's okay. You can actually hold that. I was going to ask you one more question.
Oh, yes.
Thanks for sharing the history behind the bear. I just feel like everything in your collection has some crazy story linked to it, and it's like a whole rabbit hole every time. But I wanted to ask you if you have anything coming up exhibition-wise that you would want to share with our audience.
When I was young and living in northern Nevada, many of the bars had jackalopes in them. And the jackalope is a mythological creature, I thought, of a jackrabbit that had the horns of a deer. And I was fascinated by them, and I believed in the mythology of that, and later found out to understand that jackalopes actually do exist. They're jackrabbits that have tumors growing out of their heads, and these tumors were studied by scientists and doctors and discovered that there was rabbits suffering from papillomavirus. And the study of that actually led to vaccines, which saves people's lives now. So as I was falling in love with this mythology of jackalopes, I decided I wanted to make one and make the most important jackalope in the United States. And so I started doing research on it, and there was an obituary in the New York Times, a guy named Douglas Herrick, that is credited for the American version of the jackalope, but he had died, and the New York Times gave him a full-page obituary, which is very unusual for a guy in Wyoming, but he had made so many jackalopes and sold them in all of these kind of drugstore environments across the West that they thought he was important enough. And in the obituary, his son, also a taxidermist, said, "I told my father I would never make a jackalope because I'm an artist and I can do it much better than he ever did, because his jackalopes were a little rough, drywall screws, killed animals out in the prairie." So I became fascinated, his name's Mike, about finding him. And I found him in Wyoming, recently divorced, kicked out of the house, and now living in his deceased father's studio. And I begged him to make me a jackalope in the spirit of his dead father, and possibly using some of his material, which he had at his fingertips because post-divorce he was living there. And he said he would. And he made this, signed it on the back, and then I created an assemblage out of it that ended up in a book called On the Trail of the Jackalope, which just came out from a major New York publisher. I went to the book signing. Anyway, after that thing happened, it sold to kind of a big art collector, got featured in an architectural magazine, and suddenly I was the guy that could make mythological creatures. And now I've made quite a few of them. I just finished a Lepus cornutus, which is the oldest version of the jackalope, part rabbit, part roebuck deer, and part pelican, which required some very delicate surgery to pull off. And that was headed for a show at the Denver DU show that Jeffrey Shamus was putting on, and then COVID came and kind of quieted that down. I also made a fur-bearing trout, which is another mythological creature of Colorado history, that in wintertime the Arkansas River is so cold the trout have to grow fur in order to survive. And that original fur-bearing trout is in a fish hatchery outside of Buena Vista, and I met with the museum out there, took pictures, and recreated my own version of that, so that happened. And once my reputation for making mythological creatures grew, I had an opportunity to make something for a documentarian chronicling the history of Mike the Headless Chicken, which is a very famous Colorado story about a chicken that was killed by its owners in 1945, and though missing a head, continued to live for a year and 8 months. And in my excitement to create this creature, research, collecting ephemera, newspaper articles, magazines, I came in contact with a guy who claimed to have helped raise, very old guy now in his 90s, helped raise this headless chicken in Fruita, Colorado. And I went to visit him, and I asked him if he had newspaper articles, magazines, maybe a picture or something. He goes, no, he didn't have anything of that, but he goes, I have something better. And he walked back into his house, and he came out holding his hands like this, and he asked me to guess which hand, and I guessed this hand, and he said, no. And then I said, what's in that hand? And he opened it up, and in the palm of his hand was the head of Miracle Mike, the Headless Chicken. Of course, I went crazy when I saw that, and I looked up because I was already researching it, I had photographs of the severed head, and I compared the two, and I knew immediately that it was legitimate. So all of these stories have delved into this new thing that I'm putting together, and it's going to be Colorado's mythical creatures. I just finished a painting of a jackalope, which is one of my better paintings, if I do say so myself, that I've done for a while. And so it's leading to a body of work telling interesting stories about Colorado history through the myths and natural environments where these stories came out of.
Where is it going to be showing anywhere yet?
I have a friend that has a gallery. He calls gallery MFC to make it sound kind of sexy, but it's actually the front end of Metropolitan Frame Company, and he gives me a show every single year, and he knows it's going to be weird. And I've been doing this for about, I don't even know now, 7 or 8 years, and UFOs was my last UFO history in Colorado, circus history in Colorado, which is where the tiger came into play, and this one's going to be mythological creatures of Colorado.
Awesome. Thank you. Yay. Yeah, it's always like that with Bill. There's like a million stories that like pile on top of each other, which I love. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Fernando Orellana. And I'll wait for Jess to move the camera. So these 4 pieces behind me are the work of New York artist Fernando Orellana, and he could not be here today, but he did come and talk about his work the weekend of opening night. And so if you want to watch that, that's on our website, and he talks very much in detail about these pieces, a lot more detail than I can go into. But starting here, this is a series. He has a lot more pieces. I think there's like 7 or more in the series. And these are generative robots. They're 3D printed, and they have, it's a robot, so it moves around. And they're created in the spirit of play, and he's very much inspired by mid-century modern aesthetic. And yeah, so these are very much mimicking kids' toys and building blocks. And I think there is even some Lego inspiration in there as well. And they are meant to move very slowly, kind of in the background, so that when you look back at them an hour later, they're in a different configuration. And he's been making robots for over 20 years and working with mechanics and engineered artwork. And so this is another example of some of his work in regards to nostalgia and precious objects. These 2 pieces really have that element within them. That one's a little squeaky. We actually had to do a little bit of maintenance on it, so I think it's a little rough right now. And that is really the nature, too, of mechanical objects. We all drive cars every day. We have cell phones. They break down. We have to fix them. I wasn't really thinking about that aspect of the collection when I curated this show, and so there's definitely been some coming in and fixing things and working on things. And I think it's just part of the work. It's part of the process. It's part of the reality of making these kinds of things. But back to these pieces here, the objects that you see on the pedestals are precious objects that Fernando acquired from estate sales of people who had recently passed away. And these particular objects were considered really precious to the people that had passed away. This is a collector who had a bunch of toys, collectible toys. He had gone to this guy's house and he bought this Mr. Peanut butter maker toy. And then this one over here is called Her Child of Prague. And it's a religious artifact that was very sacred and very precious to its previous owner. And then so what Fernando is playing with these pieces is this idea of the ghost in the machine. And he creates, this series of work is created for the deceased to interact with their beloved objects. And how it works is there's 3 sensors. There's an electromagnetic sensor, there's an infrared sensor, and there's a temperature sensor. And whenever all 3 of those sensors are triggered by a ghostly presence, I guess, which he did study a little bit about paranormal technology to create these so that he could find the parameters that he would set those levels at or program those levels at. But whenever they're triggered, the status on this little screen here goes from normal to event. And then you can get an EMF reading, a temperature reading, and an infrared reading there. And what happens is that it triggers the mechanism to start making peanut butter. And you can scan this QR code here to watch the video online if you want proof that it actually makes peanut butter. So That's called His Butter, and this one's called Her Child of Prague. And when this one is activated, it spins around and it says the Lord's Prayer. And this one has been programmed to activate, I think, 5 to 6 times a day. So if it does go off while we're here, it's definitely like programmed to do that so we can experience the mechanism in motion. However, this one is not programmed. So if it goes off and it says event, then all of the all of the sensors have been activated. But a lot of his work it kind of vacillates in this field of, just sort of otherworldly, sort of supernatural stuff. I think he also had a machine that searched for the word God in a radio. Really interesting work. I'm a huge fan, and I'm so glad that we were able to fly him out to talk more about his work. So if you want to do a deeper dive into Fernando's pieces, definitely get online and listen to the presentation. But these will be here through, there we go. These will be here through July 1st.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Like right on cue. We have one more artist in the exhibition. Their name is L.A. Samuelson, and they are a Denver artist. And we're going to walk just around the other side to kind of take a peek at their piece. This blind a little bit. So we're going to close the blind a little bit so that we can get a better view of this video here. It's meant to be closed. We just had it open and forgot to shut it. And we had it open because LA mailed us a cassette tape loop to play for you all just for this one night event only. Of them talking about this piece and what it means to them. But L.A. Samuelson is a dancer and a performance artist who also works with materials in a really interesting way. I find their practice to also have like a tenderness about it. They do a lot of work around what it means to be in a body that identifies as non-binary. This work in particular, when I first learned about LA's work, what I was interested in putting in the show was a piece called Bike Machine. And it was a machine that they created out of a lot of bike parts. That was a performance piece as a way of getting in touch with their dead father who had passed. And I think there was just like a lot of longing and tenderness there within that work. And I mentioned my interest in that work, and so LA didn't have that work anymore and decided to create this work, which is very much in the same vein of that previous work. And so the original audio that goes with this contains voice messages of their father and their partner's father that had been left on a voicemail cassette tape a long time ago, and they compiled those audio messages and created a tape loop that sort of runs between these two videos here. And it also degrades over time because cassette tapes, they don't hold that audio quality forever. If you've ever like tinkered with cassettes or grew up in the 80s or 90s, over every time you play them, they lose a little bit of quality. So there is this kind of elements of like impermanence and something that you kind of lose a sense of a little bit that maybe is barely noticeable over time. So without further ado, if Jess, you want to give me a hand, we're going to try to play this cassette tape and hope that it actually plays all the way through, because this is a very precarious piece. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. But that precarity of the work is definitely intentional here. So I'm going to set this down. Okay, ready, Jess? I'm going to count down. Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Is the sounds of each of us gargling, and then underneath the gargling are voicemails from each of our parents, playing and circulating from her box to my box and then back again. We are dipping our heads in, and the other person is having to hold us in place. I'm thinking a whole lot about precarity and labor and working to line something up for a temporary amount of time, and what it means to be devoted to a kind of impermanence, and what that means over a long period of time. This is a piece that falls apart, and the folks at Hi everybody, this is L.A. Samuelson. I'm recording this from Clinton, New York, and I'm talking quickly because I'm hoping to play this on the tape loop you're looking at, which means it needs to be under 2 minutes long. So basically, this is a work I created with Emily K. Harrison, who is an artist and my partner of 10 years, and Adam Stone, who is a sound artist who has worked with me a ton and also taught me how to take apart these tape players and play a single loop of tape between them. Very grateful to Adam for that. This is a piece about my relationship with Emily, and just a way to play with or experiment with how the things between us are ours individually, but become something that kind of circulates over time. And so that's what's happening here with the tape loop. You can see, or what you're hearing is the sounds of each of us gargling, and then underneath the gargling are voicemails from each of our parents, playing and circulating from her box to my box and then back again. We are dipping our heads in, and the other person is having to hold us in place. I'm thinking a whole lot about precarity and labor and working to line something up for a temporary amount of time, and what it means to be devoted to a kind of impermanence, and what that means over a long period of time. This is a piece that falls apart, and the folks at
It sounded like, do you want to turn this off? It sounded like they were going to say the folks at Union Hall or something.
Which means it needs to be under
Okay,
2
1,
minutes
2, 3.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that pretty much wraps it up. LA will be in town the early June and is going to help us get the audio going on this in a more permanent way. So hopefully if you come back to see the exhibition, this piece will be up and running with the audio. But you can check out all of the bios and website addresses of all of the artists if you're interested in following up or looking into any of the artists here. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming and for joining us. And the show will be up through July 1st.